Merry Christmas, everyone. It's that time of year again. Christmas special. Let's get into this one. This is an exciting Brood War Ace match from '09 between two of the most popular players ever. On the left there, the Tyrant Jaedong. On the right, Bisu. Notably on the right here, Bisu, this is a guy who revolutionized the Protoss vs. Zerg matchup. In the mid-2000s, like 04, 05, 06, Day 9, who was at the peak of his powers in those years, once quipped that, yeah, Protoss vs. Zerg is weird for the Protoss because you sort of open up with like a little 2-gate timing that you hope works and then like try to expand. There wasn't really a solid place in the metagame for Protoss, especially in the early mid-game, trying to get that natural up. Remember, maps in that era were way more claustrophobic. If you think about the beginning of Wings of Liberty, when you had weird maps like Kulos Ravine and Steppes of War, close positions on the maps that were decent like Lost Temple, you can sort of understand how the maps were in early Brood War. Or if you play other RTS and see the default maps, quote-unquote, that like the game devs will sometimes put out that are just hilarious and unplayable. It was sort of like that. It took the community a while to really get a handle on like making the best maps. So Protoss was really having a hard time taking the expansion in that matchup. What Bisu did was he revolutionized the matchup entirely. Bisu, who is in the bottom right there, known as one of the fastest players ever and probably the best Protoss ever, really understood that going Corsair and getting map control was going to be a major important part of the matchup. And like I said before, people didn't really understand what to do in the matchup. I know that sounds weird now with YouTube out and translated guides, but think about like 04, 05. There's literally not YouTube. You couldn't get replays from like the replay site people pull them off of now. The Korean pros weren't sharing replays. Replays were very hard to come by in general. They were plagued by bugs. It was just so hard to learn the game, even if you think about communicating. This was so long ago that like texting on the cell phone was still on the come up. You're going to shoot someone at IM on AIM, to get games. This is an archaic era of the internet. When you talk about preceding YouTube, you really need to try to wrap your head around how that affects how you would learn something and approach something, especially as difficult as this, right? So the metagame moved a lot slower, and a lot of the way that it was sort of enhanced and had, nitrous in it, so you will, souped up, was these Korean team houses. All the best Korean players in the world were living together and doing nothing but playing Brood War. And then if they weren't that good, they were also having to do chores at the house. Jaedong on the right side here of Heartbreak Ridge got his natural down. A few lings will come out and ward away the probe. We can see Bisu is working at getting his natural, going for a bit of a forge opener here. The notable thing about Heartbreak Ridge, of course, is there's a huge cliff over the natural. You guys know how much I love maps with cliffs over the natural. I always talk about Lost Temple. I've already mentioned it in this cast. Lost Temple was a map in Brood War that was played a decent amount. But you really need to understand, Lost Temple was a map in Starcraft 2 that they freaking used in the GSL. This had a high ground without a ramp, that you could drop tanks and Thors on that was within range of the natural. It was so absurd. And if any time someone's being a loudmouth in 2v2 in their Zerg, and I challenge them into a 1v1, I'll host on Lost Temple as a joke, destroy them, and then offer to host on a real map. At which point they rarely accept. Kudos to you, by the way, if you're the sort of guy in a 2v2 who does his best, but when challenged will step up and play the 1v1. There was nothing more contemptible than the player who would run their mouth constantly or team kill or sandbag or be a crybaby, and they never agree to the 1v1. Like if you're playing a 1v1 game, you're playing random 2v2, if you think your partner's really terrible, prove it. Like you're in the perfect avenue to prove it. It's not like, oh, if you're talking mess in League of Legends, and it's like, what are you gonna do? Like, go bottom lane together and see who sits 50 CS first? For those of you who played that jokish game, you remember, like, they did that all-star event that was sort of cute with all the name guys, like Saint Vicious and the big fellow, the mid laner, Scara. And then then the following years, they changed it to like single lane, quote unquote, skills challenge, which was literally just like AD players like rushing level 2 and flashing on each other with Ignite. And if you're thinking, Venom, who the hell cares? I totally agree with you. Because what we're watching right now, Brood War, means so much more than any esport. And what I just described to you is like a perfect example of why League of Legends means so little, and why Brood War is the best esport ever made, and one of the most legitimate forms of skill out there, as we see a Citadel coming down after a Stargate. I was talking about the Bisu build earlier. That's where you abuse Corsairs to get map control and then go DT. There were no Overseers in Brood War, the Overlord detected by default, but Bisu understood how obnoxious you could be with the Corsair and how insanely strong it was. Also, there he is right there, Bisu, a very handsome player. Also, the power of just killing Overlords within the context of having Overlords all over the map is really good for Zerg, and just the sense of vision and RTS and being able to scout and lining up drops later. Having Overlords everywhere on the map is a massive advantage. And I know that sounds super obvious, but if it was, Protoss would have been opening Corsair way earlier. I would expect him to get Legs and Storm, by the way, here. Not a given in this era, as we see the archives come out and the Corsair limiting the vision. If you've been a fan of the channel for a long time, God bless you, and if you just got here, make sure you subscribe. But if you've been a fan of the channel for a long time, you know that one thing that I've been an advocate of in Starcraft 2 is what I like to call the Pult Viking, although I asked him about this at a LAN and he refused to take credit for it. The Pult Viking is in Terran vs Zerg when you make one Viking and just shift A move it around the corners of the map and clear Overlords. Limiting vision at basically no APM cost, very little in-game like mineral and gas cost, and then you clear out all the Overlords all over the map for your subsequent drops. It's so good regardless of what style you're playing. Even if you're going mech, limiting the vision is so good. Making one Viking makes the intelligent Zerg player have to pull every freaking Overlord back. So I always thought that was just a brilliant check to do if you were Terran, and it's part of the basis of what makes the Bisu build so good. Zerg is the reactive race. They use Overlords to scout. Remember, there's no Overseer in this, there's no Changeling, okay, as we see a DT come out. This is in fact the Bisu build. This is a Pro League ace match, by the way. Jaedong with 2 hatcheries at the front of his natural, as Corsairs are clearing the Overlords. There was this really weird thing in Brood War where, like, if you were Zerg and you were playing against this and you were playing against a person who is good at doing this, you would just lose all your Overlords. And I know that sounds absurd, but let me tell you something. The Queen does not exist in Brood War, and there's literally a flying spellcaster that's sort of a joke called the Queen in Brood War, as Jaedong catches the DT there. That's so freaking good. Very well played by him as he made a unit at the front there to make it a little more narrow. The Queen is, it gets colloquial said, oh, the Queen's a spellcaster, and it's just like a dangling, and if you haven't actually like played Brood War, you don't know what it's like. I've actually been playing a bit of Brood War. I've just been desperately trying to get my friends to play with me and my little brother. It's obviously the hardest freaking game in the world, and it's very daunting to see a Scourge swoop in there, scouting a touch, looking for a missing, a dangling, a stray Corsair. But I've had to resort to the ladder, which is just an absolute zoo. If you think the StarCraft 2 ladder is bad, with unlimited free accounts and like the barcode situation, and like you could go on and on. Even, you know, if you wanted to babble about the current meta and the shield battery, I just love this, by the way, these FP VODs. You saw this at MLG Dallas, where on either side of the main stage you would have each player's POV. I just think that's brilliant and so cool and fun to watch. A great way to learn too. And you guys don't understand, like now, yeah, you can rip the replays off the internet and there's a lot more access and they stream on a Freak or whatever the hell it's called now. But guys, back in the day, it was so hard to get any access at all to the Korean players. You were never going to get a stream, but even like a stray replay. I remember Noni, the great American player, the Protoss, telling an anecdote about trying to rip build orders from old Proleague and MSL, which was like GSL back in the day, VODs, and he would joke about like, yeah, right whenever you would be trying to figure out if he was getting an upgrade or not, they would cut to a shot of a fangirl in the crowd, and you were trying to puzzle out a build on pieces of information of them showing the Protoss side, and then it's a minute of the Zerg and the crowd shot, and then the caster talking about something on the map, and then we're back to the Protoss, and he's done two different things, and it's like, I wonder which order he made those buildings. Jaedong with the flock of mutas out here as the Protoss is trying to get a touch of map control, and there's this weird dynamic in this matchup of this is how it is now. It wasn't necessarily this way back in the day, as the mutas scream in and a storm comes down. The Protoss player opens Corsair to prevent muta in the same way in Starcraft 2. The Phoenix is used to sort of not necessarily counter the muta, but just freaking stop the Zerg from making them. If you play Protoss, it's one of the most annoying things in the world to try to do with mutas when you're not ready. Jaedong there flying and sniping a Templar. That's the primary function the Mutalist serves outside of a surprise tech switch or initial harassment if you can guarantee they're not going Corsair. If you're a big old school fan, you'll know that whenever Jaedong switched to Starcraft 2 and HOTS, Heart of the Swarm, and joined Evil Geniuses, the Muta tech switch was literally his signature move in Zerg vs. Protoss. Like freaking Jesse Pinkman and Chili P. Nobody did it more than Jaedong. He would go double Spire and get double upgrades. He'd play in this like weird eclectic style where he would play like sort of extra wide in terms of how much of the map he took. He would get some spellcasters and then famously rush Ultraling, force a certain army, and then flood Muta. We saw, I don't want to say similar because this was like a distinct creative thing Jaedong did, but just to use an analogy, in Wings of Liberty, Zerg players would use the Broodlord to force a lot of Viking from the Terran player and then switch into Ultra after the Terran would make mass Starport and literally try to transition into mass Viking to offset the Broodlord. Now famously in Wings of Liberty, the Ultra was a joke, and there was a running joke among Zerg players in that era that the Ultra was like the cutest, most expensive way to lose a game you were ahead in. They were super expensive and not that useful. They would get stuck on stuff as Jaedong snipes a High Templar as the map is being forged upon northbound by the Protoss player who's laying down some filthy storms. Bisu just laying down storms all over the army of the intelligent tyrant Jaedong. That's a huge part of this matchup is Size Storm. It's whether you can get to Size Storm if you're Protoss and maintain your natural. It's how good are the storms in the fights. Furthermore, what I was saying earlier about the mutas is the whole point of what the muta does in this matchup is it snipes High Templar, because the Hydra, just like the Hydra in StarCraft 2, is sort of clunky and doesn't move very fast, and if it gets a storm thrown on it, it's done. They're not very tanky. They're not that responsive in either game. I mean, they're just sitting ducks, okay? And you don't have a Roach meat shield. The Roach does not exist, as Idra once quipped. Roaches really are god-awful units. The thing about Brood War is it's like everything has a purpose. And within the I'm not like every single matchup, but I mean like within the matchup, it's just like such a beautiful, perfect game, and it's so interesting to watch, and the matchups are long, and it's so mechanically difficult, and it never at any point in my watching Brood War with the same sort of like eye roll that I am with like current StarCraft 2 in the shield battery and just the state that game is in the current meta. We can see Bisu here is taking the bottom half of the map, 12 o'clock. He also has grab bottom left. Heartbreak Ridge has a really weird expand pattern in the sense that if you're on Jaedong's side on the right, your natural is above you, and then the Heartbreak Ridge runs on the right side of the map all the way up to top right where your third is, and another storm goes down. And then the fourth is really weird. You got the corner base on either side, which is basically indefensible unless you commit to something, unless you have Nidus Tech up. The middle map, which is literally suicide. And then the 12 o'clock bases are gas only, so it's sort of pick your poison. I love playing this map though, and when I play this game with my buddies, when I can coerce them to get on, this is one of the maps we play is Heartbreak Ridge. I just love stuff where you can hide stuff up on the cliff. I had one game against my buddy Paladin where I got a couple lurkers up on the high ground. Shout out to Paladin. And Brood War is so insanely taxing, mechanics-wise, that when you can sneak in annoying little harassments, it's way more difficult to address them. In StarCraft 2, you have F2, where you can use your whole army on one hotkey. And it's just way mechanically easier. There's unlimited building select. In Brood War, you have to click every building individually and make the unit. Click, left click Z, left click Z, left click Z if you want to make zealots. StarCraft 2, you hit W to have your warp gates, and you just let it fly. You can also do a lot more corny little hotkey tricks in StarCraft 2, and Brood War is more pure in a mechanical sense, because in Brood War, you're like highly restricted in terms of hotkeys. Even in the freaking remastered, they wouldn't let you change the camera hotkeys, which is insane, isn't it? Like they wouldn't let you have more than 3 camera hotkeys, and it's so difficult to learn when you go from StarCraft 2 and you literally have camera hotkeys mastered. F1 is your main, F2 is your natural, F3 is your third. I mean, you guys get it. But then it's like, okay, your F1 keycap literally worthless. Take it out. So then it's like you have to relearn all your muscle memory. You're going a tick down. And even if you're a not that good player, and it's like you're trying to use F keys, but you're not that consistent, which like I was honestly got it to the point where I could use up to F5 consistently, which is weird as it to say as is it. I'm proud of that, okay? Because if you guys play the game, you know that like when you get to like F5 plus, it's sort of hard to have control of that. But as I was saying earlier, the newer player is able to like consistently do F1 and F2, even if you're inconsistent about your hotkeys, like you're going to get your main and your natural camera hotkey. So to have all that muscle memory and not be able to use it in Brood War is just so irritating. And then the camera hotkey limit in Brood War, you can only have 3. Again, I find that very irritating as someone who sort of got spoiled and had unlimited camera hotkeys. Look, I think the control group limit is good, and I'm not saying I'm good at taking advantage of it or dealing with it. My Brood War micro and macro is a joke. I hope at some point I can get good enough at Brood War to post some FPOVs on this channel that I'm not embarrassed about. Because as it stands, Brood War is a huge struggle for me. And the quality of game you get on the ladder is so insanely low. It's absolutely so hard to learn that game. One of the best things you can do as Zerg is get lurkers on high grounds because it's very difficult to ford. And we see on Heartbreak Ridge, obviously, this is a really old game from 09. Bisu's career peak was in 07. That's when he really pioneered the Bisu build. And him and Jaedong were both at the peak of their powers around this era and into 2010. And the Bisu build is so great because you're limiting the Zerg's vision and then running in there with DTs. And you're really snowballing your harass and utilizing your multitask. As a plethora of storms come down there and wipe the lurkers, Bisu tries to push up on the high ground, but Jaedong immediately reinforced. Now the thing about Bisu's strat here is he's having to lead with the storm, which is of course standard in what you would do now. But after he blows all of his storm, he's out of mana, and then he can't really do the next fight because he needs storm to fight hydras. Like I said, so much of this matchup is about storm. Also, this being an old VOD, you can't see the minimap super well, and you probably don't know Heartbreak Ridge by heart. The thing about Heartbreak Ridge is, yeah, it has a big cliff over the natural, but it has a bunch of like wheeling spoke high grounds that spew out from the middle as we see Bisu surging forward, leading with his Archons, which of course do plus damage to bio, They're so good against Zerg. You get to drop all your storms, and then you make a few Archons. I love when we see these armies from Protoss that are like 6 or more Archons, and they just mow Zerg down. They walk Zerg down. It's crazy how good it is. In StarCraft 2, to a lesser extent, as we see Jaedong coming up here with Defilers, doing anything he can to try to stop the bleeding. And this is one of those examples of you're just trying to grab everything from your rallies and see what pops. You're in complete crisis management mode. And this ain't StarCraft 2 where you get to hotkey all your eggy wegs. StarCraft 2 macro is, I don't want to say it's easy because it's not. StarCraft 2 is like still, it's a beautiful game and it's really difficult. But StarCraft 2 is like if you made the most like perfect responsive RTS. The units are all super crisp and responsive. They listen, like the mining is there, the hotkeys are there, like it's seamless in terms of it's like mechanical execution, almost like Modern Warfare 2 Kappa. Like the meat and potatoes of the game are like perfect. But the part of the beauty of Brood War is how the mechanical restrictions affect the game and affect the difficulty of it. Jaedong's 12 o'clock getting cleared out here by Zealots. The ranged units here really just zoning. One thing about StarCraft 2 fights versus StarCraft 1 fights is the StarCraft 1 fights last longer and have more strategic depth to them. StarCraft 2 fights end very quickly. They're full of splash damage, and oftentimes it's sort of like the fight occurs, the player wins, he pushes and ends. You know why he pushes and ends? Because he can just hit 5 once and hold A down to make a huge reinforcement of Marines. He can hit W to make a big reinforcement of Warp Gate units. As Jaedong GG's as his third, gets cracked there. Bisu wins the H match. So Jaedong set up a contain at the top of the high grounds there very intelligently. But Bisu led with his Templar, got the storms down, reloaded with his money units, and continued to push out. Notice that like every time Bisu moved out on the map and harassed, as he gives a finger wag there, he's got the earring going. No Korean player had more like fangirls and swag than Bisu. I mean, if there was another guy, Jaedong, you're looking at him right there, another handsome guy who had a lot of fangirls. Jaedong was famous for being like decisive and wearing his heart on his sleeve and being like a cutthroat player in terms of strategy. Bisu was more of an innovator in terms of the Bisu build and the PvZ matchup specifically. StarCraft is like the most special game ever created, and if you guys enjoyed this cast, make sure you subscribe for more. These games were not in English. Have a good one.